US Treasury Department is now reporting that our debt service payments are now over $1 trillion a year. We are very rapidly getting to the point that our national debt service payments, just the interest on the debt that we got to pay, exceeds the amount of money that we pay for our military. And historically, when countries get to that point, they begin to decline. There is a way to fix it. But first, we need to acknowledge this is a bipartisan problem. Republicans only care about the debt and deficit when Democrats are in charge. Historically, the best spending deals, and it pains me to say this, but the best spending deals have been when a Democrat's been in the White House and a Republican Congress has been on the other side. Bill Clinton and the Republicans in Congress in the 1990s actually balanced the federal budget. It's the last time they did a budget that balanced. Taxes went up a little bit, frankly, but the budget balanced. And we were not adding to the national debt. When Barack Obama was president, it was the conservatives in the House of Representatives that forced everyone, including their own party leadership, to go along with the what was it? Oh, now it escapes me. But they had a plan, sequestration. That's what it's called, sequestration. So the Republicans had a plan where the Democrats had to agree with the Republicans to actually cut the size and scope of the federal government. All right, y'all, I got a package being delivered from FedEx, and I'm the only person here, so I got to sign it live on the radio. You guys get to witness this. Thank you very much, by the way, for coming. Not a problem. Thanks. I'm the only person in the office expecting a package today, and here I am live on the radio having to sign the FedEx package because I couldn't wave the signature on it. So, nonetheless, quick and easy. FedEx is awesome. So Republicans and Democrats, when Barack Obama was president and Republicans were in Congress, agreed on sequestration. Contrary to what you might have been told, sequestration was not a reduction in the growth of future spending. You know, that's what typically happens in Washington, is they agree to cuts, but they're cuts to future growth in spending. Sequestration was actually real-time cuts to existing growth in government. So actually the size and scope of the federal government went down. The problem some people had is that it cut defense. Sequestration, Republicans and Democrats could not agree on where to cut or how to cut, so the agreement was to cut everything. But it worked. We're going to have to go to something like that because here's the problem. Our national debt is growing so large that at some point, taxes on everybody, including the middle class, have to go up because you won't be able to cut government enough. We are still within a window where you can begin to cut government in order to solve the problem. So how does this work? Well, you remember a fraction. Remember a fraction. Fraction has a numerator and a denominator. A numerator and a denominator. So our national debt as a fraction of gross domestic product, the debt is now beginning to exceed our gross domestic product. So put the debt on top and the GDP on the bottom. The GDP is the denominator. The debt is the numerator. Now, what some people think we should do is we should reduce the numerator by throwing a lot of money at the national debt and shrinking it. No, sirree, Bob. What you do is you grow the denominator, the gross domestic product. You expand the size of the economy, and then suddenly the debt as a percentage of the economy does not exceed the economy. Now, let me put this in more practical terms to you. We talk about pies in this country, growing the pie economically. Let's talk about the fixed size pie. The fixed size pie is the total economy between the government and the private sector. If you want to grow the denominator, grow the gross domestic product in this country, expand the economy so that the debt as a percentage of the economy is less than 100%. You got to grow the denominator. You got to grow the underlying economy. In order to grow an economy economically, liberal and conservative economists would all agree you have to shrink the size of the government. As the government shrinks, the share of the private sector grows. As the private sector grows, remember, a private sector is always more efficient in spending than a public sector. Why? Because a public sector is command and control. We have a federal government where Congress says you're going to spend this much on this. In a private sector, it's arm's length transactions that can be renegotiated as things change dynamically, so money is spent more efficiently. So as the private sector grows, the economy grows. And as the economy grows, the debt to GDP ratio begins to shrink. And as the economy grows, it produces more tax revenue. And as the economy produces more tax revenue, that tax revenue can then be fed into a federal budget to then reduce the deficit every year. Now, let me explain the deficit and debt for those of you who don't know the difference. Every year, Congress runs a deficit. Our expenditures exceed our income. At the end of the year, if the deficit still exceeds income, if we still have a deficit, that deficit then rolls over into the national debt. And our national debt is the total annual deficit compiled over time. You want to shrink and get rid of the deficit, you have to reduce the size of the government and increase tax revenue. You grow the economy without raising taxes. You've grown the economy. You've increased money to the federal government. Why? Because there are more people making more money. So even if taxes haven't changed, more people making more money, their percentage of income goes up, their amount of money they pay in taxes goes up. The other thing you do, you begin to shrink the size of government, start cutting government. You can cut government programs. You can cut salaries of people in government. Not a lot of money there, but you can do it. You begin to whittle down the size and scope of the federal government, get it back to its core functions, which you're going to have to do. You've reduced the cost of government. You've expanded the private sector. The expanded private sector begins to produce economic growth. Between the reduction in the size and scope of the federal government and the increase in the private sector and the efficiencies of the private sector, it increases tax revenue to the government. You begin to pay down the national debt. And what have you done? You haven't raised taxes. You've just shrunk the government. And you've stimulated the economy. This is a hard truth for people to understand, particularly on the left. When you grow the government, you shrink the private sector. The private sector spends money more efficiently than the public sector. As the public sector grows and becomes more burdensome, it's harder for the private sector to innovate. In particular, it's harder for small businesses. Big businesses and wealthy people use the complexity of a big government as an advantage against small businesses and the middle class. But here's the dirty little secret. Democrats don't actually like the middle class. Democrats like the billionaires because the billionaires are almost all of them donors to the Democratic Party. But Democrats in their socialist-oriented thinking, their communist-oriented thinking, the bourgeois are bad. And the bourgeois, who are the bourgeois? The bourgeois are not the billionaires. The bourgeois are the middle class. They're the farmers who own the land. They're the shopkeeper who owns the means of production in the economy. They're the bad guys because they're the ones who are presumed to hoard the capital. The billionaires and the poor are who the Democrats like. The poor because they'll vote for them for their social welfare spending. The billionaires love the Democrats because they keep government complex as a subsidy to the billionaires. So you got to fight the Democrats in order to cut government. When you cut government, it simplifies government. And when government gets simple, the middle class resources are freed up to compete in the private sector against the billionaires because the middle class no longer has to hire lawyers and lobbyists to compete to navigate an overly complex system. The efficiencies of the money begin to be spent in the private sector, which grows the private sector, which grows the economy, which generates more tax revenue, which pays down the national debt, which gets the national debt service payment less than $1 trillion a year. This is not hard. This is not rocket science. I went to law school to avoid math, and yet even I know this. Everyone knows this. But what you have to have is politicians with a will to cut the government. Now, this is a problem for Republicans right now because Republicans have become big government too. The Republicans becoming big government Republicans want to grow government to award their friends and punish their enemies in the same way Democrats do. The solution for Republicans is actually to take the ring of power and throw it in the volcano and melt it, destroy the government as it is, scale back the powers of Washington, reduce the size and scope of the government. Here's the problem for the GOP. Every time Democrats get elected, they are willing to lose their election to grow the government. Look at Obamacare. They all went down in flames in 2010. Republicans had the biggest sweep since the 1800s, but the Democrats locked in Obamacare, played it for keeps. Republicans need to do the same in reverse. Get rid of the government and play for keeps that way. You get rid of the government, you get rid of their power, you reduce the government, you expand the economy, you get rewarded by the voters for growing the gross domestic product of the private sector, and they return you to office because you've made government make sense again and you've made the middle class competitive. Republicans just lack the will to do it because once they get power, they're scared to death of losing it. And because of that, they lose it every time.